Few parties have had a greater impact on the course of 20th century party building in Latin America as a whole than the American Revolutionary Popular Alliance, or APRA, of Peru. The APRA was one of the first anti-establishment parties in the region that set out to mobilize a broad multi-class base of support from the very start. And within just a couple of short years, it had developed a party organization that was the envy of Latin America. Anti-imperialists and socialists throughout the region soon looked to Peru's APRA for inspiration, and mass parties in countries like Chile, Venezuela, Cuba, and Costa Rica would soon come to adopt important elements of the APRA's populist and anti-imperialist ideology and its organizational style. But in terms of legislation and policy, the APRA was also the great underachiever among Latin America's major 20th century parties. Shut out from power for over half a century, the APRA never got the chance to implement its populist political program. And by the time that it finally assumed the presidency at the end of the 20th century, it had already transformed into something quite different. When it first developed in the early 1930s, the APRA was by far one of the best organized and broadest based mass parties that Latin America had seen up until that point. But its longer-term trajectory as a party is also a cautionary tale that reminds us that even the strongest and best organized political parties may fail to win power if their opponents are determined to shut them out. Throughout the 1920s, Peru had been governed by the dictator Augusto Leguía, an establishment politician who had seized power in a coup following a disputed election. In 1923, there was a wave of pro-democracy protests against Leguía's regime by a coalition of university students and workers. These protests were violently repressed by the government, and most of the leaders of the protest movement were arrested and deported from the country. Among the student leaders who were sent into exile was a young man named Victor Raúl Aya de la Torre. During his exile, Aya de la Torre travels throughout much of Latin America, and he comes into contact with student activists in other countries who share his worldview and who are engaged in similar struggles against their own governments. Aya de la Torre soon comes to realize that his struggle against Leguía in Peru is just one piece of the broader struggle against imperialism and oligarchy that is playing out across much of Latin America in the 1920s. In 1924, while he is living in Mexico, he founds an organization called the American Revolutionary Popular Alliance, or the APRA, which he originally intended to be a transnational political movement that would liberate Latin America from U.S. imperialism and also from domestic oligarchic dictators like Leguía. In 1926, Aya de la Torre publishes an article in the British Marxist newspaper Labour Monthly that outlines the APRA's agenda and introduces for the first time the 5-point program that becomes known as the APRA's Máximo program. This program includes, first, action against imperialism. Second, the political unity of Latin America. Third, the nationalization of land and industry. Fourth, the internationalization of the Panama Canal, which was under U.S. control at the time. And fifth, solidarity with oppressed peoples throughout the world. Aya de la Torre organizes an Aprista cell in Mexico City the following year, and like-minded activists in other countries organize similar cells in Cuba, Argentina, Bolivia, and Aya de la Torre's native Peru. By the end of the 1920s, the APRA appears to be well on its way to becoming the transnational liberation movement that Aya de la Torre had envisioned. However, events in Peru soon push Aya de la Torre to focus almost exclusively on his native country for the remainder of his political career. The dictator Leguía is overthrown in a coup in 1930. A military junta takes power in Peru, but the junta soon faces a major wave of labor unrest that convinces the military government that it does not have enough legitimacy to hold onto power in its current form. In early 1931, the leader of the military junta announces that there will be a free election in which he will be one of the candidates. Restrictions on political freedoms are loosened, and opposition activists like Aya de la Torre are permitted to return from exile. Aya de la Torre returns to Peru in July 1931, and he immediately launches his campaign for the presidency. Although he has been away from the country for nearly a decade, his presidential campaign quickly attracts broad mass support from across several different sectors of society. His earliest supporters are members of the university-educated middle class. Aya de la Torre had been corresponding with former university classmates in Peru during the late 1920s, and these activists had already started organizing Aprista cells that were able to quickly spring into action as soon as Aya de la Torre announced his campaign for the presidency. However, the APRA was never intended to be an exclusively middle-class party, and Aya de la Torre's writings during his exile had emphasized the importance of mobilizing both the workers and the peasants into this broad, multi-class anti-imperialist movement. To that end, Aprista school teachers in small towns scattered throughout northern Peru soon reach out to their former students from working-class backgrounds, and they recruit them into the Aprista movement by emphasizing Aya de la Torre's populism and his calls for a redistribution of wealth. Some of these teachers raised the party's profile among the working class even further by organizing night schools that are aimed at politicizing the working class and educating it about the party's doctrine. In this way, the APRA soon attracts the support of various labor activists who were already working to organize the large sugar plantations along the northwestern coast. And this turns the labor movement of the region into a stronghold for the APRA for decades to come. Many of the wage workers on these plantations are actually seasonal migrant workers from the northern highlands. And when they return home at the end of the season, they help spread the reach of the APRA to their native villages. And many of the peasants of the northern highlands are soon attracted to the movement by its calls for land reform and the strong indigenista currents of the party's early rhetoric and ideology. The APRA grows more slowly among the working class of the major urban areas, and it takes many decades for the APRA to become a significant force in Lima. But already by the 1931 campaign, the APRA has begun to attract some working-class support in northern cities like Trujillo. Thanks to the involvement of many of its party activists in union organizing on the sugar plantations, the APRA becomes closely identified with the Peruvian labor movement as a whole, and by the mid-1940s, the APRA ends up displacing the Communist Party as the dominant force within Peru's largest labor organization, the Confederation of Peruvian Workers. During the 1931 election campaign, the scattered Aprista cells and working groups coalesce into an intricate party organization. At the base of this organization are the cells, which group together anywhere between a dozen and 200 party members who reside in the same neighborhood or village. This is a highly adaptable type of base unit that is capable of discharging all of the normal functions of local party organizations, but which can also operate underground for extended periods of time should the party ever be banned. The cells answer to a series of executive committees at the national and regional or departmental levels. The early APRA follows a very centralized and top-down style of party organization. The party cells would often receive specific instructions from the executive committees, and the departmental committees might choose the activists who would be responsible for organizing a new cell in a given neighborhood. However, the party soon develops a minimal level of internal democracy through a series of regional and national congresses, plenaries, and assemblies that are responsible for electing the next executive committees and debating the party's long-term strategies and political positions. These congresses also play an important role in integrating the party's new recruits into the internal life of the party. One of the APRA's early goals was to incorporate and politicize the sectors of Peru's population that had historically been excluded from electoral politics. And participation in these cell meetings, congresses, and plenaries was the formative political experience for many of the APRA's early members. By the time of the 1931 election, the APRA has also developed a strong party bureaucracy in the form of secretariats that are organized along thematic areas. Many of these secretariats have the same name as government departments, such as the Department of the Interior and the Department of Defense. This was ostensibly supposed to prepare the party to implement its program from day one as soon as it won power. But the APRA's enemies would later cite this structure as supposed proof that the APRA was trying to operate a parallel state structure by carrying out many of the functions of the government within its own party organization. These secretariats also played a role in overseeing the local cells, and they would often designate a point person in each cell who would be responsible for carrying out the secretariat's work at the neighborhood level. Over time, the APRA develops a variety of other party organizations as well, including a women's wing and a youth wing called the HAP. During the periods when it is allowed to organize above ground, the APRA also operates a series of locales called the casas del pueblo, or houses of the people. The Casas del Pueblo are the party's seats or regional headquarters in the various cities and towns of Peru, but they are also much more than that. They provide a variety of services to party members and supporters, and they would often operate their own restaurants, libraries, barbershops, pharmacies, schools, and sports facilities. They resemble the radical clubs in Chile that we saw in an earlier video, though unlike the radical clubs, the Aprista Casas del Pueblo would normally serve a much more working-class clientele. By the time of the 1931 election, the APRA would seem to have all of the ingredients that make for a successful political party. It has a well-developed ideology that resonates with large swaths of the population. It has a charismatic and well-respected national leader in the form of Aida de la Torre. It has a diverse, multi-class base of support, and it has a formidable party organization that is able to generate intense levels of participation from its activists and members. The one thing that the APRA does not have, however, is permission from the political establishment and the military to actually take power. In our next video, we are going to examine the series of events that kept the APRA out of power throughout the duration of Aida de la Torre's lifetime. The tragedy of Peru's APRA reveals an uncomfortable truth about party building during Latin America's era of mass politics. While strength of numbers and a strong party organization are essential for any mass movement that hopes to challenge the political establishment, these resources are not enough for a party to gain power on their own, as long as its enemies have both the desire and the coercive capacity to keep it out of power at all costs.